Hi, my name is Jennifer and I'm with Martingale, here today to bring you a trunk show of quilts from the book Two-of-a-Kind Quilts by authors Lissa Alexander and Susan Aki. You might be familiar with both those authors as they've each single-authored books, but this is the first time they've joined forces and they're bringing you 12 scrappy quilt designs. Both of these authors are so great at scrappy designs, but there are lots and lots of extras packed into this book. First and foremost, you should know that they're also showcasing the work of their quilters, Maggi Honeyman and Sue Rogers. And they've got tons of tips inside for things that you're going to want to know about your quilt making from start to finish. So let's get started looking at a couple of quilts. This first beauty that I'm going to show you is called American Pavement. And the challenge that these two authors came up with here was to create quilts from two colors, but something other than white. Often we see red and white quilts or blue and white quilts, but what about mixing two colors together? So Lissa chose red and blue and sort of a courthouse steps, log cabin style block. But what I think is really interesting about this, and you have to kind of look closely, is when she pieced her units together, they're rectangles and not squares. So it makes this ingenious design, a little new twist on a log cabin style quilt. This is American Pavement. Susan's variation of a two-color quilt is called Ruffled Hibiscus. And a coral hibiscus is Susan's favorite flower. She is from Florida. And so she used that color inspiration to come up with this peach and green beauty in all different shades. It's still very scrappy, but it also was a way for her to use a favorite large scale print and mix that in. So this is Ruffled Hibiscus, absolutely stunning. Another pair of quilts in the book focuses on things that go together. So Susan chose dots and stripes as her favorite pair of two things to make the quilt Daisy Squared. And Daisy Squared uses a fun block. It looks complicated to piece together, but really it's just a single block that if you carefully set it out with the sashing, the secondary blocks are formed when the sashing goes together. The block construction isn't difficult. You're simply making the blocks the same throughout the entire quilt and only partially constructing them until you get there. So that is Daisy Squared. The next quilt is called 1x2 and it's from Lissa Alexander, and it uses a combination of two things that go together, honey buns and jelly roll strips. And if you're not familiar with those, pre-cuts available from Moda Fabrics, honey buns use 1.5 inch fabric strips, and jelly rolls are of course 2.5 inch wide strips, and Lissa's combined the pair of them. Some are leftovers that she's had when she's finished a project. She enjoys setting all those aside and putting them together, and says this is the perfect quilt to use up your leftover strips from other projects, or of course you can cut strips from your stash of fabrics as well. This quick to stitch pattern makes a great gift because it goes together quickly. And one of the unique things that you'll find is she's also added some embroidery stitches just to embellish it a little bit. So if you're looking to add a little something extra that you see when you get close to your quilt, up close and personal, you can see what Lissa's added to hers. All right, let's look at a scrappy, spectacular quilt. This one, is called Big Wreaths. So I'm going to lower it down here so you can see a couple of these wreaths. And this is by Lissa Alexander. If you're a scrap quilter extraordinaire and you believe that everything goes in together, you'll enjoy the mix of fabrics. Lissa likes to collect 2.5 inch charm packs, and she sorts them all by color. She breaks them open. If that gives you a little nervousness, don't worry about it. But she breaks them open, sorts them by color, so when she gets ready for a project like this, she has a nice mix of neutrals and low volume prints she can use as her lights, and also just a great variety of colors here. So this one again is called Big Wreaths. Susan took a different Scrappy approach, and one that might make some of you more comfortable if you're not a fan of the Everything Goes palette. This one is called Safety First, and it is scrappy. You can probably see the different tones of grays throughout. What you might not notice on camera is the difference in the low volume prints. The whites and the creams are a mix also of scrappy prints. So it's really a mix of 9 patches with this big red plus sign in the center. And what Susan used as her inspiration was sort of that beach blanket that you would see that had been carried around for years and worn. So she picked sort of weathered grays and wanted that look overall that was more casual, and put that together. So a beautiful scrappy quilt, but very controlled palette as well. Let's look at a couple more photos from the book. We'll look at this quilt first from Susan Aki called Windjammer. And she says she may not own a windjammer in real life, but she certainly was the master of her paper boat flotilla. So maybe you remember making those little paper hat sailboats from when you were a kid. She does remember those fondly, and living again in Florida, loves making things that are sort of inspired by the water. And in this particular group of quilts or pair of quilts, Susan was inspired by the cool half of the color wheel. So all the blues and green tones, and using a very scrappy mix of prints and palettes. And of course, the newspaper print is really the star here on Windjammer. So Lissa took the other half of the color wheel and used the warm colors to make her quilt Sunshine Day. If any of you are fans of the Brady Bunch back in the 1970s, maybe you remember them singing the Sunshine Day song. And when I hear that, it's sort of like an earworm. I can't get rid of it. But one of the things that Lissa shares is that 2 colors she'll never get enough of combining in quilts are pink and orange. To her, it's sort of like that raspberry and orange sherbet combination. And the lights in this quilt are the frosty parfait glasses. It really is a beautiful, warm assortment of prints. And don't be afraid of the triangles here, because they really are not difficult to piece together. And Lissa shares her expertise with you every step of the way. Let's move on to a spectacular quilt from Lissa Alexander. And I want you to look at this one for a moment and think about what you see. This quilt is called Garden Path, and maybe you see giant green stars, or maybe you see a white plus sign where there are 9 patches in the corners of those blocks. I don't know which one you saw first, but the challenge that Lissa and Susan gave one another was to create a pattern where a secondary design would emerge. So the block of this quilt is in fact the white plus sign with the 9 patches in the corners, and the big green stars are created by the sashing. A spectacular design. That's Garden Path by Lissa Alexander. And next up, Susan did a quilt called Roundel. And you probably can see a sort of medallion quilt emerging from this, where you would start with a center and go around and around to create the entire design. However, Susan designed this really in 4 quadrants with a center sashing to get that medallion style to appear. So you don't have to go around and around. It's just a creative way to get a secondary look by piecing things into 4 sections. Spooky Waves by Susan Aki is one of the seasons Susan loves most, is all things Halloween. She always says, did I mention the candy? I like that part too. But she particularly loves the softer color palette featuring lighter oranges and charcoal grays rather than a vibrant orange or an inky black. She used the Cake Mix foundation papers by Moda to make quick and accurate work of all those triangles, but don't be put off by them. You can make them however you wish. And once you've pieced them, the real fun begins as you mix and match in this spin on an ocean waves quilt pattern. Another holiday design quilt is from Lissa Alexander, and it's called Mistletoe. Now this beauty is really one that focuses on a combination of traditional holiday reds and greens. And Lissa had a sleigh full of scraps under her tree that she wanted to make into this gorgeous quilt. She uses them all the time in her holiday quilts. And what she wanted to do in this was to play up the greens and make them be the star of the quilt as opposed to the red. So inside the books, you'll find that she worked with her machine quilter, Maggi Honeyman, to make them sparkle. And Maggi shares her secret for how she did that in the book. Last but not least, in the book, you'll find a section called The Big Finish. And inside there are tips from Maggi Honeyman and Sue Rogers, the extraordinary machine quilters who work with Lissa and Susan. And they share tips on thread and batting and working on the scale of your quilting design in proportion to your quilt. And they also share with you the #1 mistake they see quilters make when handing off their quilt to a machine quilter. So you'll have to pick up a copy of Two-of-a-Kind Quilts by Lissa Alexander and Susan Aki wherever you buy books, or look for it at shopmartingale.com.